Going into the 13th and final round of the Tata Steel Masters, Fabiano Caruana led the field by 1.5 points. In other words, he'd already won the tournament. So, did that mean that he would just cruise in with a draw, you know, a nice gentle victory lap? No, this was another really hard-fought game. He played against the Russian Vladislav Artemiev, and this is how it went. So, Black often in this position plays with knight f6 and bishop g4, but instead Caruana played with knight d7, intending to go e5. Now d4 would lead back into possibly kind of Catalan positions, but c4, so this is more akin to a standard sort of Reti English. And we get a fairly standard position where Artemiev recovers the pawn with queen a4, but that gives Black the chance to develop his queen's bishop, that queen's bishop on c8. That's often the problem piece in these positions, but you play b5 with tempo, and then you can play the bishop to b7 on this all-important long diagonal. So the players develop their pieces. I mean, I would say by this stage that Black is pretty close to equality already. I mean, it's quite a well-known kind of position. Artemiev isn't really testing Caruana in this position at all. Now, he's played a4 here to try and weaken that b5 pawn. He's trying to tempt it forward. So Caruana's next move, c5, is very important. That means that after knight c3, that he's able to bring that queen to b6. If you push, then that actually leaves the c4 square weakened and a knight could settle there. So after knight c3, the queen comes to b6 instead to protect that pawn and maintaining this strong pawn front for Black. There are no weaknesses there. So Artemiev starts to exchange pieces. I mean, I don't think there's really much better for White in this position. You know, if anything, Black could be slightly better in this position because Black has a little bit more space on this side of the board. But Black has yet to castle. That's one problem. Now, Artemiev played bishop g5 here, just straightforward development. If he plays queen b3, now that's an important move because White threatens the pawn on b5. So again, if he could provoke that pawn to move forward, then he has some squares to use. But instead Black would play knight d5, and that's an important move. And if knight takes b5, there's a pin here, and bishop c6. That spells trouble for the knight because of the pin. So in other words, it's impossible for Artemiev to break up those pawns, and that means his minor pieces, his knights, can't find good squares. So that's why I say this position is roughly level. So rook a1, at least that takes the open a file, although you can see all those potential entry squares here on a5, a6 and a7. They're covered by Black's pieces, so it's not particularly dangerous. Caruana threatens the bishop, and now it doesn't really have a good square to go to, so Artemiev exchanges off, but that does give Caruana a nice bishop on f6. Now knight d2, exchanging off the bishops, and rook c8 from Caruana, and queen b3 attacking that pawn. He's still trying to get that pawn to advance, but no. Good play from Caruana. The rook and the queen cover the pawn on b5. Now I think if White plays a move like knight f3 here, I think it's about equal. I don't think Black has too much here at all. I mean, you can try to shake things up, but I think it's hard. Instead, well, knight e4 came, so the knight attacks the bishop. That bishop is on a great diagonal, so Caruana saves the bishop, just nudges it back to e7. And now I still think moving the knight to f3 is the best idea. to cover these squares. But king g1 played instead. That's a little bit cautious. And here Caruana takes the initiative with f5, driving the knight away, and then he plonks his knight on e5. That knight covers some really important squares, and sometimes it can be possible to play c4 to open up this diagonal, and that knight could land on g4. So that's why Artemiev played h3 after a long think. H3 at least covers g4, but it does rather weaken the king side, and Caruana attempted to exploit this straight away with pawn to h5. He wants to just push on again. So this provoked Artemiev into a move which compromises his pawn front. He plays knight f3, because that knight is a dangerous piece. So that means that Caruana could exchange off, and you can see that exchange leaves the d pawn isolated, these pawns are doubled. So not a pleasant position, not a pleasant pawn structure. One positive from doing this is that now the e file is opened, so white can try to target the e6 pawn. So bishop f6 played anyway. The bishop returns to that beautiful diagonal. I mean, it's a key piece, and that bishop is now covered because the d5 and e4 squares are covered by the pawns. So rook e1 played. Yes, those pawns don't look great, but at least there's an avenue to attack the pawn on e6, which is covered. So no drama. The knight swings round, trying to get into f4, and that's prevented from going there by the pawn coming to g5. But g4. So why is Artemiev advancing like this? Well, what he's trying to do is find a square for that knight. At the moment you can see it's covered, any interesting squares are covered. But after g4, he's trying to get that knight in, perhaps via g3, into one of these squares. There's a lot of paint on the board, let's take it off. So it's all about giving that knight a square. We can see how brilliant that bishop is, but that knight is poor at the moment. Now after g4, remember, taking on f5 is threatened. There's this pin here. So Caruana has to exchange everything on g4. So there are pros and cons to this move. Yes, the knight can come into this square, but of course it has opened up white's king position. So Caruana just shifts the queen over to look at that pawn, look at this down this diagonal. So white has to be very careful here. But at least that knight enters the game. And we can see the effect of that straight away. If bishop d4, then knight f5, exploiting that pin. So queen d5 is necessary to just push that queen away. If the queens are exchanged, then black has a really nice endgame. That bishop is an absolute monster on this diagonal, and soon the rook will enter the game as well. Looks very good for black. So after queen d5, the queen, instead of exchanging, just drop back, and that now allows the bishop into d4. That looks rather menacing, so the queen and the bishop look excellent. And the rook swings over, so this is very dangerous, and the knight at least lands on that beautiful square e4, and basically it's that knight that's holding white's position together. Queen e5, threatening something down there, so a check to the king, and the king goes to g7, and now b3. That make sure the pawn can't be taken. And here, well, if the queen checks, then the king actually is reasonably safe on f1. So now Caruana switches back to the f file, attacking the queen, and the queen goes to e2, and queen d5. That's a tricky move. The queen looks at the b pawn, that's one thing, but also it prevents the king from, for the moment anyway, from moving up to g2. You see, white would like to play king g2, and that could mean it's possible to take the pressure off the king with f3. But at the moment, king g2 is impossible because the rook takes pawn. You can see with the queen on d5 there is a pin. The knight is pinned. So after queen d5, rook f1. So just lending a little bit more support to the f2 pawn. Now queen b3 isn't possible. Well, a couple of reasons. Knight g5 or knight c5, both possible. Let's just see that. If knight c5 takes, queen takes, and white has busted out. So you can see that black has to be a little bit careful here. Caruana has to be careful because his king is also a bit exposed. So king g6. But basically, apart from that knight on e4, white doesn't have much space, doesn't have great squares for the pieces. And, well, white is seriously short of good options in this position. So queen d1, yeah, it's just a bit passive. It defends the pawn, but it's not a beautiful move. And Caruana took the initiative with c4. Obviously that can't be taken again because the knight on e4 hangs. King g2 played. Yeah, the pin doesn't matter here because the f2 pawn is covered by the rook on f1. Now there's an interesting option here. Caruana played bishop a7. Rook f4 is an interesting option. So if f3, then c3, and the idea is to bring the rook around to attack white on the second rank. Once the pawn is advanced, you can see the second rank is exposed. But it seems that white has just enough to hold this position. And here is the key move. Now, if that rook can come down here quickly, then white is in huge trouble. But queen h1 keeps black on his toes, threatening a check there. And white should be all right in that position. So let's go back. So anyway, king g2 has just been played. Bishop a7. So that removes the bishop, and therefore the queen is attacking the pawn on d3. f3, just supporting the knight, and pawn takes pawn. And here is where it finally goes wrong for Artemiev. He is under massive pressure here, massive pressure. That pawn on d3 is gone, but actually he's still okay if he plays queen d2 because of the pressure on the pawn on g5. And actually it's really hard for black to kind of rearrange the pieces to try and force the pawn on d3 through. You know, in the short term, he's got to take care of that pawn on d3. The rook can come over. White's king, for the moment, is safe enough here. If rook c8, now that looks menacing, but actually simply rook c1. And white should hold this position actually because of the pressure on d5, on g5 rather. But that's not easy to see over the board. Artemiev played queen a1. So he's looking to maintain his active position and, you know, in that way stir up trouble. So queen a1 threatens the bishop on a7. Bishop came in. Queen e1 might be a better shot here, but I think it's already gone wrong. So rook d1. I mean, this looks very reasonable to bring the rook across to attack the pawn. But actually, at this point, Caruana takes control because that queen is heading for this great square attacking the king. And, well, an attack on the king in this position could actually be fatal. A check, well, you can see if the king steps to the h-file, then that's going to be devastating. And if the king steps back here, then the f3 pawn is on. Moving up to g3 is immediately fatal because of bishop f4. So, in other words, white has to block on the second rank with knight d2. But once that knight has gone from e4, that takes away a lot of the danger from black's king. So queen c2 is actually a killer move. White simply can't hold this blockade together because the queen attacks all three of the pieces, and taking is obviously fatal because the rook is attacked. The rook has to move, and then bishop takes knight. So after queen c2, queen e5. Artemiev basically just goes for it with the queen, hoping for a perpetual check. Now here's an interesting moment. Which would you take, knight or rook? In fact, one of them will lead to a draw by perpetual check and one is winning. Calculation is needed. Queen takes rook actually is a mistake because now that queen is just out of play for a moment, and actually this will be a draw by perpetual check. So let me just show you what could potentially happen here. A check. Actually, the king isn't really escaping because if it tries to escape back here, then queen takes and you take the bishop, and you know, white should be fine there. But if you play bishop takes, the queen still controls squares on the c file, and that means it's impossible for white to give perpetual check. So let's just see how that works in practice. Remember, black is a piece up, and now the king can go for a wander, but you can see that the crucial checking square is covered here by the queen. So let's see this, and actually the king escapes. It's got to wander up the board, stagger up the board. Here's an important moment, of course. If queen takes rook, I think we better deliver checkmate. Let's see. Bishop f4, check. The king goes in the corner, then queen h2. If, let me see, king here, then we've got, what's the best way of doing this? Oh yeah, that'll do. Here, and queen e2 picks up the rook. Well, I think that covers all bases basically. Okay, so after king d6, sorry, in this position, after king d6, checking on b6, and now basically the king was driven up the board, but the king is going to find shelter eventually. Here's how, because in this position, let me get there, here we can cover with the bishop, and that's a check. And then the rook drops. Take the bishop, but actually now the king has cover. Let's just go all the way. Artemiev went to the bitter end, and here, well, he didn't bother with another check. You could play any number of moves. King there is pretty good, and then a queen on the next turn. So here Artemiev understandably resigned. What an incredible performance. 66 moves. Fabiano grounded out. He didn't need to. He could have just played very safely in that game. He had a nice position out of the opening. He could have simply simplified, but no. He continued playing for a win, and that is very impressive. So that meant that Fabiano Caruana won the tournament with 10 out of 13, 2 points ahead of Magnus Carlsen on 8 out of 13, and Wesley So on 7.5. A superb performance. He was only in trouble in one game against Anand, and actually most of the game he played pretty well. I think what's impressed me throughout is Caruana's consistency. He seems nerveless actually, I mean, some of his strategic games were absolutely incredible. Against Yu Yang-yi, we didn't have a chance to look at that one. Against Duda and against Dubov, these were superb technical performances. It really is worth playing through those games. Absolutely fantastic. And he just looks really smooth in the way he plays, kind of nerveless as well. And it just feels so natural. So I tell you what, he's looking good for the candidates, and I would say he and Ding are, well, the clear favourites, the two clear front runners. Magnus obviously will be a bit disappointed with his result, but 8 out of 13 for a sub-par performance isn't too shabby. I mean, he said he needed a break. Yeah, probably sounds about right, but still, you know, he's had a pretty good tournament. If we look at the live rating list, then Carlsen obviously out there first on 28.62. Caruana now on 28.41. That is something else. Well, thanks very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the PowerPlayChess coverage of the tournament. Please, if you're not a subscriber, then do hit the subscribe button. If you want to support us, if you want to see more videos, then do help us keep the lights on and check out the links to PayPal and Patreon.com as well. And I should also thank our guest presenter Yannick Pelletier for doing a superb job on the analysis as well. Thanks for watching.